Thank you, Casey. Yeah, it's lovely to be back here in the springtime, and my wonderful host and hostess, the Browns. We were out counting sandhill cranes this morning, and we got 50 birds on their property. And I just saw a lek of prairie chickens in Nebraska. They have a lot of them out there. And I live in Baraboo, and just south of Baraboo, we have the Badger Army Ammunition Plant, which was decommissioned 30 years ago. And the Ho-Chunk Nation controls 1/3 of it, and they've put it all into prairie. It's just gorgeous. And then the DNR has a third, and they've been a little slow in getting their prairie going, but they have every intention. And then the University of Wisconsin has a third. And in the corners of fields, they're planting prairie. But of course, prairie chickens also benefit from agricultural fields in the off season and so on. So one of my dreams is that we'll have prairie chickens back in the Baraboo area at some time. And on our property, the International Crane Foundation, there were prairie chickens there at one time. The former landowner remembered when they were there. I think the ringneck pheasants are a problem, though, because they parasitize their nests. And the incubation period is a few days shorter than the prairie chicken. And the pheasants hatch, and the prairie chicken, or the pheasant walks off with the pheasant chicks, the prairie chicken. So that's a mess. Anyway, Fran Hamerstrom was a great friend of mine. How many of you knew her in the group here? Okay, I'm sure we all have our Hamerstrom stories. And she would come down to Madison for various meetings, and then she would come up to Baraboo and stay at our home. And my wife was a lovely Japanese lady who wasn't accustomed to some of the primitive customs of Fran Hamerstrom. And I'll never forget the night she first came to our house. She says, "Kyoko, do you have a small tin can I could keep under my bed?" Anyway, that was a shock for Kyoko. And one night I was speaking up at Stevens Point, and I was going to stay the night with the Hamerstroms. So I came back to Plainfield after my talk, and they were sitting around that big pot-bellied stove drinking red wine. So I had some red wine, and we talked for an hour or so, and then she said, "Well, I'll tuck you in." So we went upstairs, and it was freezing cold. And there's this room facing the west, and the window is wide open. And the ruffed grouse were drumming in the woods, and the moonlight was just coming through the window. And she sort of tucked me in, and the grouse is drumming, and the moonlight is there, and I'll just never forget that moment. It was so special. When she was dying and not doing very well, I decided to invite all of her gaboons, her former students, there were 140 of them, to come to the Crane Foundation, and we have a guest house. And Fran had agreed to stay there for the better part of a week. And there's a nice apartment, and you can cook there, and so on. And the former students would come through that week, and she would take them in a golf cart around to see the cranes. And so I think there were about 45 people came through the week. And then on the last day, we had a big party at the Leopold Shack. You know, Dr. Leopold was her professor. She was the only female student of Alda Leopold. Well, my wonderful assistant, Karen Becker, was able to find something very
I've just been
special
informed by
for
our
you.
producer that could be the latest NBC has ever been on. Yeah, that's right, because it's The Tonight Show, which is delayed, then We, which are delayed, and then Bob Costas, which is delayed. So conceivably, this will be the first time they've been on this late. And you people were here for it. And because you're in such a good mood, everybody here gets a little piece of snake. Our next guest is an honored academic and author. Among her works is the Wild Food Cookbook. Here's a copy of it right here. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to this program, Dr. Frances Hamerstrom. Doctor, cleaned a pigeon, right?
Yes, and I'm so sorry I had to do it in front of you. I really didn't want to do anything so messy.
It made me sick. Because you broke the little thing's neck and just started yanking. Yeah.
Well, I realize you had a great deal to put up with.
Yeah.
But things are much simpler nowadays. I wouldn't think of doing anything
How did you get started eating and preparing wild food?
Well, when I was a child, I used to climb out of my window and sleep under a spruce tree. And that got me interested in the outdoors until I kept experimenting with various things.
Right.
All members of the violet family are good to eat. Did you know?
No, I didn't know that. You can eat violets?
Mm-hmm. They're really lovely. There are white violets.
White violets? Can I eat this?
You may indeed.
You know, is it possible that you've mispicked one by mistake and it could be deadly poisonous?
No, I
Have some kind of
you.
horrible toxin that...
No.
All right.
Do you want me to eat one first? I did.
You ate your lovely bouquet there.
Well...
Man, that was tasty. Thank you very much. Whew, boy, I had no idea.
Well, as it happened, it had a substrate.
You're melting some butter. It's starting to burn over there, Doctor. What are we going to make here? Let's just start cooking our brains out.
I am going to tell you about this substrate now.
All right.
And thank you. That is quite a mess, but that's past. There's some Cajun seasoning.
A little Cajun seasoning.
And a little butter, real butter. And a wild weed named oxalis.
Oxalis?
And snake.
And snake. There's snake meat on there?
Yes.
Wow.
Wasn't it nice?
It was very tasty.
I think so, too.
But, you know, it's funny about snake. I'm full now. Yeah.
But you can probably fix one.
Oh, man. Oh, man. Oh, come on. Come on. Just toss it in the frying pan and let's get on with it. Now, in certain parts of this country, do people still eat the snake? Oh, you're going to make us all sick again.
Are you ready?
What kind of... Man alive.
No, this is very, very hard.
What kind of snake do you have there?
It's a fox snake.
A fox snake?
Its Latin name is Elafe vulpina.
Okay.
Yes. Now, I wonder whether we could, between us...
Where did you get that to... Where exactly does a person go to purchase snake meat?
I'd never thought of purchasing it.
What is just... So you're dealing pretty much with roadkill here, then, is that...
I didn't think you'd know. I think...
Whatever you get with a Buick is dinner, as far as you're concerned. Oh, well, I don't know. Do we have time to finish this up? Do we have what?
You're not really very enthusiastic about this.
No, I don't like snakes. I don't like anything about them, frankly, to tell you the truth. Save that for the trick-or-treaters.
That's why you're going to learn to like snakes.
Oh, now, what do you have in there?
This is just a dear little one.
Man. Oh, that's a... Oh, it's... You know. Okay, that's cute. Now, no, don't chase me around with that. I'll look like a sissy if you do that. Don't do that. Okay, fine. Just drop it down your bra. Good idea. Man, you've been in the woods too long.
You've been in town too long.
No, are you going to cook anything here?
I certainly am. And
Okay, put that back. Now you... All right. What kind of snake was that?
that's a little green snake, and it's a pet.
What do you...
Its name is Madeline.
You use that for cab fare, do you? Okay. We have to go away. You just cook, and we'll be right back, okay?
You're not-
Well, that was Fran. Apparently, she made her dress out of the curtains. And she went to some beauty shop. You know, she never used to wear makeup or anything. And she got all dolled up in New York City. And her maiden name was Flint. And her family were famous in Boston for making alcoholic beverages. And the Tsar of Russia hired one of her ancestors to come to Russia to make alcoholic beverages, which of course Russians love. And several generations later, the foremost ornithologist in Russia was Vladimir Flint. And he was sort of the Roger Tory Peterson of Russia. And he and I became great friends. And it was he who masterminded getting Siberian crane eggs transferred from Russia to Baraboo of the species that was so rare. And you'll see a few pictures of Dr. Flint. But one of my fondest memories is when he met Fran Hamerstrom, and they figured out they were related. And she was from this aristocratic family in Boston, but of course went wild in Wisconsin. And so they're sitting on the couch in my living room. There are two videos. I couldn't find the first one, but they're watching the first one. And it was like she was looking at a different person. She had never seen this video before. And she says, look what she's doing now. And she's laughing and laughing and laughing. And she's actually laughing at herself, but I don't think she realized it. Well, Aldo Leopold had a big impact on Frances Hamerstrom and her husband, and they were really responsible for saving the prairie chickens, which now Sharon and many of you are involved in helping. And I'm so concerned about the solar energy threat now to the prairie chickens up here. We're having the same problem in many areas of the world where former agricultural fields are just being covered by solar devices. And these are former feeding areas of the cranes. And we'll see a little bit about that. It's actually greenhouses that are a major threat in Korea. But I'm sure that soon solar will come along too. One of the good news things about solar, though, I work a lot in Nepal. And I was flying into Kathmandu this year, and it was late in the afternoon, and the sun was reflecting off thousands of houses that fill this valley. And it was just glittering with solar panels on their homes. And each family is benefiting from that solar panel. You fly over Tucson and you don't see one, and that's where, you know, it should be covered, right? And so on. So we have a lot to learn. And what would Aldo Leopold say about that? Anyway, when I was a graduate student at Cornell University from 1968 through 1971, I discovered the Sand County Almanac. And I read all about Wisconsin. I was fascinated about Wisconsin in the 1930s and 40s when he wrote those essays. And the essay he wrote about cranes is the most beautiful thing ever written about cranes, in my opinion. And I'll give you some quotes tonight. But as I was leaving Cornell practically the day, I met Ron Sowie because I overheard him saying, I'm from Baraboo, Wisconsin, and I'd never met someone from Wisconsin. So I asked him if he knew Leopold, and he said, well, their house is, the shack where they went on the weekends out by the river in Baraboo, is only 10 miles from my home. So on my way to Japan for my first job assignment with the New York Zoological Society to study cranes, I stopped in Madison. He picked me up. I saw the shack. And their farm, they had moved their horses to Florida. So we came up with the idea of establishing a center to help cranes in Baraboo. But I really credit Leopold for introducing us, because if I hadn't been aware of Wisconsin through Leopold, I would never have met Ron Sowie. Well, out behind the shack with a view of the river, there's a Leopold bench, and there's this placard which says, "It is here that we seek and still find our meat from God." And as I'm a Christian, this is one of my favorite scriptures. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. And now back to Leopold. This is from his Marshland Elegy. I quote, "The crane is the symbol of our untamable past, of that incredible sweep of millennia which underlies and conditions the daily affairs of birds and of men." When we hear his call, we hear no mere bird. We hear the trumpet in the orchestra of evolution. The sadness discernible in some marshes arises perhaps from their once having harbored cranes. Now they stand humbled, adrift in history. This is Ron Sowie and myself when we were young. He passed away in 1987 from a cerebral hemorrhage, but I continued the Crane Foundation to this day. Last year we celebrated our 50th anniversary. Our work at Cornell University's Laboratory for Ornithology was about cranes. I had become interested in cranes up in Canada. I'm a Canadian. In Alberta, when I observed the migration of sandhill cranes in spring. I could hear them, but I couldn't see them. And I got out my binoculars, and finally I could see these tiny birds circling around high in the sky. And that was the beginning of my fascination with these birds. How could a bird that far away be so loud? And my work at Cornell ended with this evolutionary tree of the cranes, which I determined by comparing their behaviors, their calls, and their visual displays. Well, cranes are found on most of the continents. We don't know why there aren't any in South America, but they never got there. But so many in Africa and Asia, but only 2 in North America. And the sandhill crane, which you all know, is very, very abundant. It's the most abundant of all the cranes. There are more than 1 million sandhill cranes. And the whooping crane, also found in North America, is the rarest. They were reduced to just 15 birds in the migratory flock back in 1941. Well, cranes are beautiful creatures, and they're huge birds, and people understand what they are. The prerequisite for keeping cranes on Earth is the conservation of wetlands. And in our work, cranes migrate from one country to the next, especially in Asia, from the north to the south. And we have to get these different countries to work together. So that's a big part of my job. But cranes have cultural significance. For example, the indigenous people here in Wisconsin, the Chippewa, in 1849 took this painting to Washington to tell the President of the United States that the Crane clan and all the other clans represented by different animals are united in their minds, as indicated from the lines going from the head, and their hearts, that these lands in northern Wisconsin should be set aside and protected for our indigenous people. Of course, it was never recognized. This is our sandhill crane, and one of the reasons they're very successful is because they paint their feathers with mud. And this pair is just beside my driveway. There's a little patch there where apparently the mud has the right amount of iron. And every spring they spend a few days painting their feathers, and the iron oxidizes, forming rust that chemically links with the feather and can't be washed out. So they turn from light gray, which you see at the top of their neck, which is not painted, to this beautiful russet color. And when they sit on their nest, they're very difficult to see because they look like a muskrat house. And they just lay 2 eggs a year, and they usually raise a single juvenile. But both the male and the female assist in incubating the eggs and in rearing their chicks. In contrast to the sandhill crane, the whooping crane likes huge marshes, as do all the other white cranes. And the reason they're white is because they become very obvious to intruders of their own species. It's like bright white lights shining out from a huge wetland saying this is defended territory. And because their nest is usually far from the upland areas, the terrestrial predators seldom go out in these big marshes. So the whooping cranes are very obvious. And if you are a hunter, it's much easier to see a whooping crane than it is the sandhill crane. Another thing, the sandhill cranes never become flightless. They just molt 2 or 3 feathers at a time of their flight feathers, whereas the whooping crane drops all of their feathers at the same day and are completely flightless for about 6 weeks. So cranes dance. They eat fish and crabs and clams and so on. The whooping crane is much more aquatic, depending on live animal food. And in Texas, where the whooping cranes winter, each pair of birds defends a territory of about 500 acres to produce enough blue crabs to get them through the winter. Most cranes have areas of bare skin on their head, and they can contract and expand that red depending on their mood. And if they're about to have sex, they have the red expanded to the full extent. If they're afraid or cold, they will contract the red, and you can't see any of the red at all. So the colored area is the former breeding ground of the whooping cranes in Louisiana and eastern Texas, a non-migratory flock, and on the Great Plains, a migratory flock. We think there may have been as many as 10,000 birds when settlers came to the Midwest. The blue areas are their former wintering areas. And the birds were completely wiped out on the Great Plains. The last nest was 1922 in Saskatchewan. And the last nest in Louisiana was in 1939. But somehow a tiny little group of whooping cranes survived north of the prairies where there were no people in an area called Wood Buffalo National Park. The reason for their demise was outright killing by humans. Now you imagine you're in one of these covered wagons and you're in the middle of Iowa and you have your land, and you build a sod house, and you have to get enough food. There are no stores. You've brought potatoes, and you plant enough to hopefully get you through the next winter, and you hunt. So just about all the large mammals and birds were absolutely obliterated from the Great Plains. They included the bison, the elk, the antelope, the deer, and the big birds like the trumpeter swans, the sandhill cranes, the whooping cranes, and so on. And the grasslands were turned into agricultural fields, and many of the wetlands were drained. The whooping cranes disappeared. Young whooping cranes sort of look like sandhill cranes. They're brown, and that helps them hide in the grass. So that's what happened. Now, what happened in the United States and Canada in the 1800s, the early part of the last century, today is happening in the Middle East. And I'll explain to you a new program that we are starting in the Middle East, which includes 30 countries, not 2 countries. And we have a wonderful man working at the Crane Foundation, Wally Modacek from Afghanistan, who will be heading this program, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So from 15 birds, the cranes gradually increased. Today we have maybe 550 cranes. They breed in this Wood Buffalo National Park, where we also have the very rare and unique wood bison, about 3,000 of these enormous bison that are much darker and bigger than the prairie bison. Here's a pair at their nest. They migrate in small flocks through the heart of the country, down into Saskatchewan, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and on to Texas, where they establish their winter territories not far from Corpus Christi, in a place called the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. And if you'd like to come to Texas in the winter, in late February, we have a festival in the town of Port Aransas, and we have special boats that take you out along the Intercoastal Canal to see the wild whooping cranes. So they're slowly increasing. And now we have a second flock of whooping cranes. And they fly from Wisconsin, not far from here. We have a bunch of pairs breeding at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge, down into the southeast. These birds came from the breeding of whooping cranes in captivity. This is the headquarters, 250-acre campus of the International Crane Foundation, and in the distance, surrounded by forests, a place where visitors can't go, we have 4 streets of crane pens. We call them crane dominiums, and we have whooping cranes and all the other species of cranes in the world, but mostly whooping cranes because we have a program to bring them back into the wild. One of the first efforts to establish a new flock of whooping cranes was not done by the Crane Foundation. It was done before we were very active. Way back in the 1970s, the US government and the Canadian government took eggs from Canada, 1 egg from each nest, because they have 2 eggs, but they usually only raise 1 chick, so you don't hurt by taking 1 egg out. And they took 289 eggs over the next 10 years, and they put the whooping crane eggs into the nests of sandhill cranes out in Idaho, in a place called the Gray's Lake National Wildlife Refuge. The sandhills hatched the eggs, they fledged 64 birds and migrated with them to New Mexico, to Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge on the Rio Grande River, south of Albuquerque. And these little whooping cranes imprinted on sandhill cranes, and not a single pair of whooping cranes formed. And so we had to discontinue the experiment. But they survived very well in the more upland habitat of the sandhill cranes, much more adaptable than we ever guessed. So we had to figure out another way of getting whooping cranes back into the wild. We could raise birds in captivity, and they're very afraid of people. They're imprinted on whooping cranes. But if you release them, the parents are still in captivity. The parents are dumb. They've never migrated. Their ancestors migrated. They were taken from the wild too as eggs. So we developed a new technique. It's called costume rearing. And these wonderful people are enduring a very hot summer day out in a marsh with a bunch of whooping cranes that have never seen normal people. And whooping crane juveniles stay with their parents for 9 months. They migrate south with them, they come back with them, and then they're kicked out. So we could go out in the prairies and in the wetlands with our whooping crane chicks and teach them all about living in the wild, feeding on frogs. And you haven't lived until you've looked for frogs in a marsh when it's 100 degrees out and you've got a bunch of whooping cranes behind you. But then we took it one step further. By working with a group in Canada called Operation Migration, we were able to teach the whooping cranes to follow crane-costumed pilots. And this all happened at Necedah, and we flew south with the whooping cranes. Then in the spring, they had the instinct to return to where their GPS had been set, which is the area in which they learned to fly. Now, these two experiments, the failed experiment with imprinting, the successful experiment with costumes, is perhaps going to be a way we can bring the Siberian cranes back to the Middle East. So I want you to keep these two techniques in mind, because it gets a bit complicated later on in my talk. But we'll leave the whooping crane now, and we'll go to the other very, very rare white crane that depends on huge wetlands in northern China and southeastern Russia and in Japan. This is the red-crowned crane, which many people consider to be one of the most beautiful of cranes. Their outer wing feathers are white, not black, and they use their inner wing feathers for display, very complicated display, including this arching that they do, and their dances are like a choreographed dance. Absolutely gorgeous birds. And they're the heaviest of all the cranes. A big red-crowned crane will weigh up to 25 pounds, whereas the large male whooping crane will weigh about 18 pounds. They sometimes rear 2 chicks. They require huge expanses of wetland, and that type of habitat used to be found in northern China, where there were enormous marshes and thousands of red-crowned cranes that wintered all over the Korean peninsula, all over eastern China. We don't know how many thousands, but many, many thousands. And today, they are reduced to just a few places in China, and that population that comes down to the coast north of Shanghai numbers about 500 birds. That's all that's left. But we have a more robust population because they breed in Russia. Now, what happened is during the Korean War in the 1950s, there were several 100,000 Chinese soldiers came to fight against the United States and South Korea in what we call the United Nations forces. After the war was over, those soldiers were not allowed to go home. They went to northern China to dig drainage channels to create China's great northern food basket on these former wetlands used by the red-crowned cranes, and only a few small patches are left. The crane is a special bird in the Orient. In the Forbidden City, cranes are guarding the emperor. Throughout the Orient, at marriage ceremonies, lots of cranes bringing you long life, happiness, and marital bliss. In Japan, during the late 1800s, when Japan modernized, the cranes were massacred all over Japan. Although they were culturally significant, people were very poor and they ate them. And they were reduced to just 24 individuals. And after the World War II, their numbers had increased to about 40. But they had very cold weather. The wetlands in northern Japan where they fed froze over, and the school children put corn out on the ice, and that began the tradition of feeding the cranes in winter. And this is a feeding station with lots of photographers taking beautiful photographs of their treasured cranes. And that population has increased to 1,800 birds because of the winter feeding and so on. Now, my program will not advance. Is our guy still here? Well, while we are waiting.
Can I ask a question about?
Sure.
I'm sorry. The population of the hybrid cranes, what happened with them?
They weren't hybridized.
Oh, they didn't? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Colin. I don't know what's wrong. They were normal whooping cranes. They were just sexually imprinted on sandhill cranes. Yeah. But they eventually all died out because they didn't breed. It's not advancing. I don't know why.
There's a little pop-up on your computer.
Okay. Please don't leave. I always come an hour early before my presentations because I never trust technology. So here they are in the fields in Japan. Now, the mainland, the Japan population is non-migratory, and they have 1,800 birds. So we have 500 coming to China, but we have 2,300 coming to Korea, to the Korean Peninsula. And they used to be all over the Korean Peninsula in the lowland areas, particularly along the west coast where there are big mud flats. But today, you cannot find a single crane in North Korea, and I'll explain why, nor in South Korea. And in North Korea, it's because of poverty, and in South Korea, it's because of development. And from both sides, for different reasons, the cranes are now squashed into what we call the demilitarized zone. The video is going over the airport at Seoul. 22 million people are down there along the river, the Imjim River. And the white line indicates the DMZ. It's 4 kilometers wide. That's about almost 3 miles wide. You'll notice that there are streams going through the DMZ, but most of the area is mountainous until you get to the central highlands. And this is the Chorwan Basin, where the heaviest fighting occurred during the Korean War. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives, and today that's the most important area for the cranes. As we continue east, the mountains get higher. Of course, the cranes could never winter there, and that goes right to the Pacific coast. This Chorwan Basin used to be a huge city. Hundreds of years ago, there was a kingdom up there. There were 3 kingdoms on the Korean Peninsula, but this kingdom failed, and it turned into an agricultural area. The dark area to the north is the demilitarized zone, and south of it, there's a zone of land. It's 8 miles wide. It's called the civilian-controlled zone. And in this zone, agriculture is permitted, but you cannot live. No houses, no people in there at night. And you have to be out by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The farmers can go in from about the 1st of March until the 1st of November. From the 1st of November until the 1st of March. That's the winter period. And in the springtime, the farmers go in, they flood the fields, they grow their rice, and then they have to leave. And there's a lot of waste grain in the fields. And this has produced an accidental bird sanctuary. We have over 100,000 geese spend the winter there, and thousands of cranes. Okay, it's the summer now in the civilian-controlled zone, but look what's coming up: greenhouses. And of course, this is taking over the land, and land that can no longer be used by the cranes. Now, this land is not owned by the farmers. It's leased. And the owners are very wealthy people that live in other parts of the world or in other parts of Korea. And they lease the land out to the farmers. Because the plan is, if there's ever peace between North and South Korea, this is going to become reunification city. And there will all be skyscrapers and factories and whatever to provide jobs for the North Koreans and so on. So here we have a flock of, this is the white-naped crane. Last winter, there were 10,000 white-naped cranes along the DMZ in these few areas. Remember, most of it's mountainous. There are just very few areas for agriculture. And we now have a big threat to cranes called avian influenza. And we lost 8,000 cranes in Israel 2 years ago, and 30,000 in Hungary last year, in a place where about 250,000 Eurasian cranes gather. So should we have avian influenza along the DMZ, we could lose most of the white-naped cranes that survive in the world. Well, there's the Chorwan Basin in green, that green triangle, and the black line is the demilitarized zone. But to the north of it, we have another big plain on the Nambi River that comes into Wonsan, and this is called the Anbian Plain. It's in North Korea, and it used to be a major wintering area for the red-crowned crane. So from 2008 to 2016, because I'm a Canadian, I had permission to go to North Korea and to work on the conservation of cranes. Well, you could say there are no cranes left. What can you do? Well, the North Koreans said, likely the cranes could come back if we have enough food for the people. Then there could be some grain left out in the fields for the cranes. So I worked with this farming cooperative. This is part of the Anbian Plain. Over those mountains is the Chorwan Basin with all the cranes. And when the cranes migrate to Chorwan, they fly right over this valley. But something terrible happened here in the 1990s. But hundreds of years ago, this pavilion was built. Can you imagine? That was built between 735 and 742, and it's still standing. The Koreans take great pride in it. It's called the Crane Pavilion. The aristocrats used to go there and look out over this beautiful basin and see the flocks of cranes in the winter. So this is a national treasure. Okay, this is what I found. People are living as they've lived for centuries. There were very few motorized vehicles, no tractors, and people were very, very poor. Well, up until 1990, they received free fertilizer from the former Soviet Union. That year, the Soviet Union fell apart, and from then on, nothing came to North Korea. Nothing came to Cuba. Cuba depended on fertilizers too. But the Cubans could grow vegetables year-round and didn't have starvation. In North Korea, the soils became depleted through the 1990s, and in 1997, an estimated 3 million people starved to death, mostly children. And somehow the government survived by getting the food for the military and the aristocrats, and everybody else suffered terribly. And during that period, this is a monument to the cranes in the Anbion Valley. The cranes disappeared. Of course, many of them were killed and eaten. If my kid was starving, they'd be eating a crane. And the crops of rice, lower and lower amount of food produced each year. So the North Koreans wanted to learn how to have more productive farmland. So what I did was to bring some specialists from other countries to North Korea with me to talk about organic farming, and especially from China, where they have organic farms. And we were able to develop a book for organic farming in North Korea. And through money from the Crane Foundation, we were able to bring some tons of seeds from China of this hairy vetch. And after you harvest the rice, if you plant the seeds of this vetch, it will start growing right up until freeze up, and then it will start growing again in the spring. They don't plant the rice seedlings until the middle of June, and by the time they're ready to plant, the vetch is about this high, and they plow it under, and there's lots of nitrogen in the soil. In addition, we brought a lot of saplings of fruit trees to put on the hills in this valley. And it was very, very successful. The agricultural production increased, and they built a beautiful piggery, and they had a theater to teach farmers from other areas of North Korea. One year they told me they had 36,000 different people come from other parts of Korea to learn about organic farming. The Chinese gave us one pair of red-crowned cranes from a zoo in China, and they made an enclosure for them, decoy birds, and the wild cranes started to come back. We had permission from the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Department of the Treasury to go to North Korea to do this work and to give them $30,000 to $50,000 a year, which I hand carried in and gave it to my colleagues, and they were able to do so much with that amount of money. And great things happened. But then I was working with the Academy of Science. The Ministry of Environment saw this successful project, and they told the Academy of Sciences that those people can no longer work on the project. They're going to take it over. And then they had no communication with us again because we were part of the Academy of Sciences. But then the US government decided nobody can do anything to help North Korea. And I haven't been able to go back to North Korea since. Then we had COVID and the whole country was closed down. But in the not too distant future, I'm hoping to go back to North Korea, being the eternal optimist, and see what's happened. I just simply don't know what's happened since 2016. So we are concentrating our efforts now in trying to conserve some of these fields on the Chorwan Basin, and the price tag for 1 acre of land on the Chorwan Basin is $200,000. Cranes are expensive birds, but efforts continue. Enough about the red-crowned cranes. The third beautiful white crane looks like a whooping crane, sort of, but their head pattern is completely different. And rather than have the very harsh calls like the whooping cranes, whoop, these ones have a musical call. Doot, doot. The female's like this, doot, and the male's like this, doot. So when they call together, it's doot, 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 doot. Like a police car in Germany. Yeah. And it was the least known of the cranes. This is a rather recent map, but I'll tell you the story. The only thing we knew is that this species existed and they bred up in northeastern Russia. Those breeding areas in the west were unknown till much later. And over the years, this is in the 1970s mainly, we found out that they wintered in Iran and in India. And Ron Sawi, the co-founder of ICF, decided to do his doctoral work on these cranes in India. They have the longest beak of any crane, and it's specialized for digging out tubers in muddy areas of wetlands. They're vegetarians in the winter. They have very complicated visual displays. This is a threat display called an open wing back display. And here's their unison call where they go doot, 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 with their beaks going up and down. And it's a sexual display to paint mud at the base of their neck just at the beginning of the breeding season, but it doesn't stick. It can easily be washed out, unlike in sandhill cranes. They migrate over the Himalayas to get to India, and Ron Sawi did a beautiful study of the birds on their wintering grounds and was able to follow them to Afghanistan in 1977 and find the whole flock, 56 birds that he'd been studying all winter at this wetland in Afghanistan. He also found that the Afghans were shooting birds, and that was likely the reason the Siberian crane was declining. This flock of birds comes to a wetland just east of the Taj Mahal. There were 200 birds in the 1960s. When Ron started his work, there were 75. That was the mid-70s. In the late 70s, they were reduced to 35, and then to 20, and the last crane was seen in 2003. And we put radios on some of the birds on the breeding grounds in Russia, and those birds stopped their migration in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, that's where they were killed. So we lost that population. Then we have a second population that goes down that line to Iran. And there were only 12 birds in this group when we found them, and they were wintering in an area where there were lots of ducks, and the local people trapped the ducks. They didn't shoot them, And because they didn't shoot them out on these wetlands where the traps were located, the Siberian cranes could find habitat. But when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1990, okay, you had starvation in North Korea, but there were food shortages in Russia too, and in this little country north of Iran called Azerbaijan. And the governments allowed hunting in the nature reserves to try to produce enough food for the people. And we lost the flock that wintered in Iran. We had meetings, we had education. This is Robert Bateman, the famous artist, and he did this beautiful painting of the Siberian crane. But we had a hemorrhaging situation with the hunting, and this is the last family of cranes in Iran with their juvenile. And this is the last bird that came for 16 years all by himself to Iran. And this was the first winter he never returned. So, very sad story. But the Russians knew this bird best from the tundra of Yakutia, an area in eastern Siberia. But it was unknown where they wintered in China. So I went to China in 1979 with a load of photographs this tall, 100 8x10 color photographs of the Siberian cranes in India from pictures that Ron Sawi took. And I gave them to my colleagues, and they sent them to their colleagues all around China, especially in the south, and they were able to find the wintering area. This is the breeding area in Russia, an aerial shot out in this tundra. There's very, very few people up there, unlimited breeding habitat, and a very short growing season. Here they are at their nest, and they have 2 eggs, and my friend Dr. Flint started to study these Siberian cranes. And he found that they lay 2 eggs a year, but they only rear 1 chick. They bandit birds, and there's Dr. Flint collecting an egg because through an environment agreement signed between the United States and Russia in 1972, between Brezhnev and Nixon, there was a way we had permission to bring eggs from Russia to Baraboo. And Ron is on the right. He's brought these eggs in a suitcase with hot water bottles, and they hatched. Dr. Flint came over to see his chicks, and we established a captive population of Siberian cranes. And this is the first chick hatched in captivity in the world from birds that were reared in captivity. And we discovered the secret to breeding them was to put floodlights over their pens, because it's continuous daylight way up in the north of Russia during the spring breeding season of the Siberian crane. So we brought those eggs to Baraboo, and the cranes migrated south, and the Chinese are looking for the nesting, the wintering area. And there are 8 species of cranes in China, and there are the Siberian cranes with their head down and a juvenile standing there. And we found the wintering area at a huge lake in southern China, and the local people were shooting the birds. There were all kinds of waterfowl there at China's largest lake called Poyang Lake. That's the Yangtze River to the north, going from west to east. And in the summer, during the monsoon, the water pours into this lake. There are also 5 tributary rivers. The lake is 120 miles long. But in the winter, the water drops down, creating this enormous mosaic of winter lakes, mudflats, and grasslands. It is without a doubt the most important wetland in all of Asia for migratory birds. And soon it was protected, and we worked on areas to protect cranes that are being poisoned and shot, and on. And we now have an office in Beijing and 7 full-time employees in China, and are working on problems to help the cranes. And the government has established 52 different nature reserves in China just because cranes are there. And it's been extremely rewarding because the cranes have responded, they're now protected, and we have over 6,000 Siberian cranes in this eastern population. And we have plans to reintroduce them into the West, which I'll explain in a minute. So all of this happened in recent decades. Here's a bird that's been there for millions of years, and we came in sort of at the last moment and found this situation. We lost all the birds in the West, but we saved the species in the East, and by establishing them in captivity. Well, this is Wally Modacek, and he was my foremost colleague in Afghanistan. And after the government fell in August of 2021, his life was endangered, and as were the lives of his 6 beautiful daughters. So my wife and I sponsored them to immigrate to the United States. And they were able to get out of Afghanistan in March of 2022. They spent 15 months in Mexico City studying English, and they had a very nice apartment. Their life was fine. And finally, they had permission to come into the United States, and I brought them from San Diego back to Baraboo. And this is the day that we all met in San Diego. So Wally he's going to work at the Crane Foundation, or he is already working. He doesn't have his work permit yet, so we can't pay him. But when he gets that, we will hire him to head this Middle East crane program. Now, in Russia, there's this remarkable lady, Elena Ilyashenko, who heads the V.E. Flint. Dr. Flint passed away, and he was so loved that they named the working group in Russia after him, Working Group on Eurasian Cranes. And although this horrible war has happened with the Ukraine, the Crane Foundation in Baraboo, we have the most wonderful relationship with our Russian colleagues, and it's so sad that we can no longer send support to them. We can't even go to Russia, but I was able to go to China this past December, and 15 of my Russian colleagues came there to Poyang Lake, and we had the Crane Festival. So despite the politics and through the internet, we're still working closely together. And Elena and her team are putting satellite radios on the cranes that migrate down through the Middle East. And by determining where those birds stop and no longer continue to move around, we know they're dead, right? And that's how we're finding out where the hot spots to concentrate our conservation work in the Middle East are. And now we have a hot spot in Lebanon, one in Saudi Arabia, one in Afghanistan, and several in Pakistan. So this is my dream. This will be my swan song if it works, because it's going to take a lot of work. So this is the migration route of our Siberian cranes to India, and they're all gone. And they go through Afghanistan, they go through Pakistan, and so on. Well, remember the sandhill crane and the whooping crane? When we put the eggs, we produced sandhill or whooping cranes that were sort of a little confused. And remember how we raised the cranes with puppets and flew with them, taught them a new migration route? So everything we learned about the whooping cranes and the sandhill cranes, we can now apply to the restoration of the Siberian crane. The Russians have established a crane breeding center, just like the Crane Foundation, near Moscow. And they can produce lots of Siberian crane eggs and Siberian crane chicks. And they have developed techniques using hang gliders for flying with these birds raised in captivity. However, because of the political situation, they cannot go south of the border. It's just too dangerous. Russians aren't welcomed in Afghanistan anymore. Guess why? But we have this other crane. This is called the Eurasian crane. And they're a huge gray crane, and there are maybe 700,000 of them all across Asia. They're sort of like the sandhill cranes of Asia. They're very, very successful birds. And you'll notice there's a couple of arrows coming down into India. And that breeding area, that dark area to the north, is where they're nesting. Then they're coming to India through Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, I am hoping that if Wally and his Middle East crane working group and Elena with all of her Russian group can all work together to implement the most amazing plan. The black arrow indicates the migration route of Eurasian cranes to India. The yellow route plus the black route is the migration route of the old population of Siberian cranes that was wiped out. So they overlap. So during the upcoming years, I'm hoping the Russians will take eggs from their captive breeding center and substitute them into the nests of the Eurasian cranes. They will raise Siberian cranes and migrate with them to India. These birds are useless for breeding because they'll be imprinted on Eurasian cranes. However, we can use them for public education about Siberian cranes. And we'll be able to see them in Afghanistan and Pakistan and so on. So they'll be used for public education before we bring, quote, normal Siberian cranes into the flyway. And if our education efforts are successful, the flyway will be safe. Just like we've made flyways safe in the United States. We're like going back to the 1800s mentally when you're talking about behavior towards animals in this part of the world. Well, at the top of the yellow arrow, we can establish a small center where we can bring eggs of the Siberian crane, hatch and raise them, and have them follow ultralight aircraft or hang gliders across Russia to where these imprinted Siberian cranes are. Then you can take a Siberian crane that's been reared by humans but imprinted on Siberian cranes and release it into the wild with a wild Siberian crane. That chick will be attracted to that Siberian crane and stay with it and follow it. That's what we're doing with the whooping cranes here in Wisconsin now. We don't lead them with an ultralight. We just raise them in captivity and release them with other whooping cranes. And that may be a way that those imprinted cranes will lead the, quote, normal cranes to India. And then those cranes that arrive in India, Their GPS has been set for the top of the yellow arrow, and they'll go back to the breeding area in Russia. So that's our long-term plan for bringing the Siberian cranes back to India. Well, too complicated. Anyway, final talk today is about this beautiful crane from the Tibetan Plateau, which is the most profound indicator of climate change, because when you change the climate a few degrees in an area where there's freezing conditions, you change the world. In the warmer countries, you change it a few degrees. It's not that big a change, but up here, it's huge. And the breeding range of this bird is over the Tibetan Plateau and neighboring areas of India, Nepal, Bhutan. Up in those mountains, there are glaciers, enormous glaciers that are rapidly melting, creating more wetlands in the valleys. And these cranes are living very near the Tibetan people. They're protected by the Tibetans. And this is the captive birds at the Crane Foundation. And some of them migrate over the Himalayas to spend the winter in Bhutan. In Tibet, the people are living on the land as they have lived for thousands of years. And the cranes are up there with them. The levels of water in the lake are coming higher and higher as the glaciers melt. The male crane has just come back to spell off the female who's been faithfully incubating, and he gives the unison call to tell other Siberian black-necked cranes that this is their defended area. But with the elevated water levels, we are losing a lot of the nests to flooding. So the Tibetan people love these cranes, so they go out and they build up these islands and getting the crane nests above flood level, and the birds are more successful. And they're rearing their chicks peacefully up on this plateau. But under the ground there's permafrost. It's frozen completely, and we call these wetlands perched. But when the permafrost melt, it's like pulling the plug out of your bathtub. The wetland just disappears. So we have new wetlands being created by the melting of the glacier. We have the old wetlands disappearing. This very dynamic thing is going on, and the outcome has yet to be determined. But our foundation is coordinating a program among these 4 countries to look at the effect of climate change on this population. And they've increased from 9,000 birds to 16,000 birds in recent decades because the greater abundance of wetlands. And it's such a treat to work in this part of the world because the people really love the cranes, and the cranes aren't afraid of people. It's such a contrast to working in Afghanistan, which is just, not that far away, a completely different culture. But Wally, my Afghan friend, says in the Quran there are lots of statements about the conservation of nature which are being completely ignored. And what he wants to do is to work through the religious communities to preach the gospel about conservation. And he's very encouraged that this may be very effective. Some of the black-necked cranes migrate over the mountains, but before they do, in the spring, they migrate way up to the breeding areas at higher altitudes. The Tibetans dress up their yaks in these costumes. They feed them a little rice wine, makes them happy. The lady's holding a shrine, and the grandma is putting the first seeds of wheat into the furrow. The first furrow is being plowed, and they don't do this until the cranes start circling around for their migration because they believe the cranes are blessing their fields. and then they plant their crops. So it's really wonderful to work in a part of the world where there's such a special reverence for the cranes, but such enormous things happening to the environment. And what can we do in the long term remains to be seen. Another group of cranes doesn't winter at all in Tibet, but they migrate over the Himalayas, flying it up to 26,000 feet above sea level. And they come down into this little kingdom of Bhutan on the south slopes of the Himalayas. The country's only 300 miles long, but it goes from the top of the Himalayas to about 300 feet above sea level. 71% of the country is covered by virgin forest, and the people are living in the zone about halfway up where it's the best climate. And that's where the cranes come into the winter, to winter in several valleys, whereas in Tibet, they are protected, and you can see them at close range at their roosting areas, and they're adored by the Bhutanese people, and often seen in agricultural areas. Here they are dancing. And this is the best dance sequence of any crane I have. It's a cold, cold morning, and doesn't seem to bother the bird that's dancing. But the other crane is a little more reluctant and is not quite as interested. And see, pulled one foot up to warm it. But watch what happens. It pays to keep dancing. Little ruffle threat, but what the heck. And this is part of the developing of a strong relationship between the male and female. The younger cranes do a lot of dancing, and guess what? The old-timers hardly do any. Well, the Bhutanese like to do the crane dance too, and they have a festival. And I go to Bhutan every year for this festival. It's in December of this year coming up. And I have the brochures down here over near the end. It's marked Bhutan, December 2024. And if you'd like to pick up a brochure, please do. And I welcome you to join me in Bhutan for the black-necked cranes. These are all school kids in the 16th century temple. And it's a beautiful festival. Goes on all day. So December 1 through 17th, you're welcome. And this June, I'm doing a trip to Mongolia, and there are brochures right there too. Mongolia has the largest expanses of grasslands, temperate grasslands in the world. You know, Illinois, Iowa, much of southern Wisconsin used to be prairie grasslands. Well, they still exist in Mongolia, and we have 5 species of cranes there, including this beautiful white-naped crane that comes to the Korean demilitarized zone. This is our headquarters. I think many of you have been there. I welcome you to come back. We're open from the 1st of May till the end of October. You can see our prairie restoration programs there. You can meet all 15 species of cranes, learn about their biology, both in captivity and in the wild. This is the director of ICF. His name is Dr. Rich Belfus, and he was an intern at the Crane Foundation in 1986 and has been with us all these years. I turned over the leadership in the year 2000, and since then have helped raise money and encouragement for the staff. We now have 125 people on our staff, offices in 7 countries, and the future looks brighter for the cranes. These are the cranes from Africa that Rich works with, the beautiful wattled cranes, the crowned cranes. They're dependent on floodplains, which are being destroyed by damming for hydropower, but only 4% of the people in Africa have electricity. So how to make a balance between the needs of the wildlife and the people is our big challenge in Africa, where the population is predicted to double by 2050. This is the blue crane, the national bird of South Africa. And more, we have to work with farmers because there are conflicts between crop damage and increasing crane numbers. I'm going to end my talk today by a few quotes from Aldo Leopold and a few pictures of the cranes that sort of say it all. Our ability to perceive quality in nature begins, as in art, with the pretty. It expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. The quality of cranes lies, I think, in this higher gamut, as yet beyond the reach of words. And here is a pair of whooping cranes photographed just a week ago in Nebraska, and this is titled "The Dance on Ice." Slipping a bit there. Whoops. And in Nebraska, we have the greatest crane show in the world. And every March, we take a group of people out there to witness the gathering of 1 million sandhill cranes, or 500,000 sandhill cranes. Well, I'm going to end with a picture of the Hamerstrom house, and I hope that someday this can become a very special place to remember the great contributions that the Hamerstroms have made to the world. Thank you very much. I welcome you to pick up literature about the Crane Foundation up at the front here, and a little book I wrote is available if you'd like one. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Alicia Ward will be a speaker on Wednesday night in Stevens Point at the Audubon Club.
Great.
Talk at the Lincoln Center.
And is she the lady who studies the prairie chickens?
So she's from the National Crane Foundation.
Oh.
Alicia Ward.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't recognize that.
So
I didn't know that.
the library closes at 5, but we have a half hour if you want to talk with George, grab a book, grab the brochures, maybe take a trip with him. And